So I'm really, if you were here this morning, you heard me talk about a through line and what it was for me in all of this. And part of it has to do with the concept of decentralization. Now, the corporation is actually a relatively modern concept, right? I like to say, and I might have said it before in a conference that some of you have attended, the corporation was the first robot, right? When I hear people talk about getting rid of corporations and moving on, I think, well, the corporation's kind of interesting, right? It does a couple of things. It provides for limited liability, and it also provides for some tax advantage. So when people come to me and they say, Steve, as I'm sure everyone in this panel is a lawyer, when people come to us and say, I want to start a DAO, I say, well, you know, that's interesting, but what do you mean? And they say, well, a corporation's bad. And I say, well, you know, do you like getting sued? And do you like overpaying in taxes? And then we have a conversation about it. But there's this really interesting question, which is that corporations and corporate structures don't always work right. They don't always work well, right? They're an interesting way of creating a person, legal personhood, that is not an actual person, not a natural person. And it allows this thing to act for others. But it also means that stakeholders, shareholders, people who own it, they don't have equal access to information. They don't have equal access to governance. So it could be that this 19th century, maybe 18th century concept of the corporation, maybe we didn't get it completely right. Maybe there's something else out there. So this panel is going to talk about, let me ask actually a show of hands, how many people here know what a DAO is? I'm going to call on you. We have some lawyers here, so you guys don't count. How many people, not including, if we take Star Trek off the table, and we're talking about as an organizational form, how many people know what a BORG is? Whoa, not lawyers, you don't count, Jordan, sorry. So this is something that is really, really new. I worked on a potential bankruptcy where one of the questions is a DAO a person for purposes of the bankruptcy code? Robert Stark would say, well, you just throw it in a corporation. We don't need to worry about that. I'm not quite sure that it's that simple. So I have on our panel Fatemeh Fannizadeh, who's a strategic advisor with the Swarm Foundation. You're based in Switzerland or Brooklyn now? I can't remember. Both, sort of? Yeah. You're a Swiss lawyer?
I'm qualified in Geneva, yes.
Yes. She is with the Swarm Foundation and working on a bunch of other really cool stuff. Alex Golubitsky, who is both a tax attorney and also a founder of a business called MetaLeX, which is building BORGs, and he's going to explain that. And then my good friend Jason Schwartz, who's a partner at Fried Frank, chairs the tax practice, chairs the crypto practice there, but is a tax lawyer and also likes weird internet art, NFTs. We've had this kind of ongoing difference of opinion if an NFT is art or not. Maybe that would be a great panel. It might erupt in violence because we disagree about that strongly. But let me start, Fatemeh, ask you to talk about what it is that you do, what the Swarm Foundation is, and how that intersects with the concept of decentralization as you understand it in the crypto space.
So the Swarm network is a decentralized data project built on Ethereum. And it is a very big scale project. It aims to revisit the whole infrastructure of the internet in order to decentralize it. And I do help with their legal setup. And the question of decentralization and DAOification is extremely relevant, especially now. This project has been going on for the past 6-7 years. And it is still being built, and it is still growing. But slowly we are in the process of decentralizing further. And because of that, I'm very happy actually to have this discussion today about the various form of entities that can help in this decentralization process.
Well, so what does that mean when you say revisit the structure of the internet and decentralize it? I mean, the internet was always already supposed to be decentralized. Like, tangibly, practically speaking, what are you building to do that? Is it web browsers? Is it data storage? And added to that question, why do these things require, or do they require a new way of thinking about entities and governance?
So we're decentralizing on the level of basically hosting and servers. So instead of having your website, for instance, hosted in one particular place, AWS is a good example, There you would host it on the network, so it's going to be, your data is going to be broken down and distributed amongst many nodes and then put together and retrieved. This is very much necessary for the future of the internet, and I strongly believe the internet is going towards that direction, although it aims to be maybe decentralized, or it was at some point at the beginning. It is not really anymore, and a lot of data depend on big corporations now that control them, that have visibility over them, and there are a lot of issues that can be avoided with decentralized web. I forgot your second question.
Yeah, I mean, we'll come back. I mean, I guess one of the questions is, nobody talks about TCP/IP and says, we need to, so TCP/IP is sort of the underlying protocol of the World Wide Web, of the internet, right? Nobody looks at that and says, TCP/IP requires us to rethink corporate structures and governance. I don't know, maybe people should have. Maybe one of the reasons for that is because there's an inherent economic incentive for telcos and ISPs already built in, so you don't need to. So what is it about this structure that requires you to problematize or ask questions that DAOs might answer? That's kind of what I'm getting at. But let's go to Alex and we'll talk about, we actually have two tax lawyers. It's interesting. I think as a lawyer, tax and bankruptcy are basically the final boss, but it's interesting that two of the most interesting lawyers in the space are both tax professionals. But Alex, I want you to talk about MetaLeX, a really interesting project that you're working on with our friend Gabe Shapiro. What is that? And it uses the term, I think Gabe coined the term BORG, cybernetic organization. What is MetaLeX and what is the BORG? And what question does it answer?
Sure. So MetaLeX, our primary business is designing and implementing BORGs, which as you said, Steve, are cybernetically enhanced organizations. And what that means is an organization that is controlled or responsive to network systems. And the primary way that we see BORGs being implemented is by being DAO adjacent entities, meaning that they're entities which allow DAOs to function in the world in ways which a computer network would otherwise have a difficult time functioning. And
well, can you actually think, probably about half of the people in this room don't know what a DAO is. Can
Sure.
you actually, can you lay some groundwork for us about what DAOs are?
So a DAO stands for a decentralized autonomous organization. And it's a term that is probably misused more often than it's used correctly. And I think that that's somewhat been to the detriment of the industry. But really fundamentally what a DAO is, I actually think of it as a voting oracle, as a way for a disparate group of people to express preferences in real time. And one of the advantages of blockchain and even TCP/IP of network systems is the ability to get immediate feedback from large numbers of people in a decision-making process. And so what a DAO is a way of coordinating this disparate group into making collective decisions. And so when we talk about designing BORGs, we're sort of talking about the next stage of that decision-making process, which is implementing those decisions in the world, and that generally should be done through entities. As Steve was sort of intimating, legal personhood is a tricky thing, and the corporation is somewhat magical in a way because it is a new person that the government has summoned into being through a piece of paper. And then if you look at something like a trust, that is an organization which you can summon into being yourself as a natural person just by writing something on a piece of paper, and you have created a new person. And this is very good. This is, I think, a positive development. But the flip side of it is the government can weaponize personhood. And if you go back, and much to the detriment of many people throughout history, I mean, I think that if you look at something like the institution of slavery, this is an example of the government weaponizing personhood by designating natural people to no longer be persons. And what we have seen in recently in the sort of DAO space and in the crypto space. And in fact, I think the first opportunity Steve and I had to work together was drafting an amicus brief in the UkiDAO case. And this is a good example of the US government weaponizing personhood. They say to UkiDAO, you seem like a person. You're a group of people acting together, and we're going to pick what kind of person you are, and because you haven't picked it yourself. And what the problem that BORG solve, and by the way, the UkiDAO case, for those who don't know, was a CFTC enforcement action against a DAO in 2022, where the Northern District of California determined that a DAO is a person for purposes of the California law and the Commodities Exchange Act, and a DAO can therefore be served with process in a lawsuit and be subject to a judgment.
Still really unclear as a practical matter what that means, of course.
Absolutely, very unclear. But it is nonetheless a fact now that if you sort of don't opt into being a person, the government will pick for you. And so one of the important facets of BORGs is managing this process of legal personhood. That we talk about DAOs as owning treasury, as entering into contracts. As soon as you start using that vernacular about a DAO, you are describing a person. Only a person can own property. Only a person can enter into contracts. And so by using BORGs, is a way of allowing DAOs to perform these legal functions in a way that is ultimately responsible to these network controls, whether those network controls are the voting oracle themselves or the actual code that is deterministic.
How many people here understood on a practical level what Alex is talking about? Okay, so I think that's not because you didn't explain it well, it's because it's so out there. What we're talking about is a new way, let me say it in a simpler way. What corporations do is they solve a coordination problem, right? In part, if you've got an entity that is more than one person, you have rules that govern how you make decisions about whether you're going to take a lease on a piece of property, whether you're going to enter into a corporation, how much money people are going to get from profits. So, I mean, would you all agree with me that what DAOs attempt to do is by using software to solve human coordination in a different way? Or did I say it, or do you disagree? What about you, Jason?
What about you? Okay, I think that there.
Nice socks, by the way.
Thank you. There's a spectrum, right?
Yeah.
And Alex, distinguished between like fake DAOs and true DAOs. I think and I don't think I would go that far. I would just say that there's a, I don't have control over the vocabulary people use, but there's a spectrum. I belong to an organization that refers to itself as a DAO, and it collects these pieces of digital art that you don't consider art. And basically, every member contributed ETH to a shared address, right? To an Ethereum wallet. The Ethereum wallet is actually just governed by 9 people, right? It's like a 5 of 9 multi-sig, who essentially pinky swore that they will vote in accordance with and deploy funds in accordance with the rest of the, DAOs, the contributors' wishes, according to a vote. And they also pinky swear that, if they ever sell the art, they'll split the proceeds among us, right? So that's like one, at the sort of most centralized, most entity-ish side of the spectrum, right? And I'll say that just to skip to the law a little bit, tax law, and I imagine non-tax law as well, would probably view that as an entity, right? It's a group of people who have come together to engage in a joint venture for profit. We buy art with the expectation that the art will appreciate, and someday, either we'll like borrow it against it to monetize, or we'll sell it to monetize, and we'll split the proceeds, right? And you don't need a legal entity to have an entity for tax purposes. And according to the UkiDAO case, you don't need one to have an entity for non-tax purposes either. You have some kind of partnership. Okay, then on the other side of the spectrum, you have a group of, the true DAO that I think Alex referred to is sort of a group of people who can collectively control software parameters, right? So you have software that lives on chain that, enables people to maybe, borrow money, lend and borrow money to and from each other, or to exchange tokens with one another in this, permissionless manner, just using the software as a replacement for what would be an intermediary in the off-chain world. But softwares, like, they need parameters, right? They need parameter selection. For example, you can program software to provide for maybe some kind of like reactive interest rate on borrowings that depend, which interest rate might, go up or down depending on the amount of, the relative amounts of lenders to borrowers, right? But you do ideally need some body of people to determine, the range of interest rates, right? Or how reactive that interest rate is. I mean, you don't need one. You can just put software out there that's totally immutable. But typically, that type of software would obsolesce over some period of time. So ideally, you have you need some group of people to control stuff. So, at the sort of most, true DAO, most decentralized side of the spectrum, you have token holders, right? People who own tokens who collectively can vote to run self-executing script that changes the nature of those parameters in that software.
Is that a person?
And then that's the question. Is that
so
a
what do you
person
think?
for
Is
tax
it?
purpose? I think no.
What do you think, Alex?
Well, I think that, yeah, actually I do. I think that fundamentally, if you look at least under US law, how you identify what a legal person is, it's really not actually because you filed something with the government or you've written something down on a piece of paper. It's because you're coordinating with a group of people for a common purpose. And so when you talk about, changing these parameters in self-executing software, rightly or wrongly, I think that under the law, you've created a person and you have to manage that. And so...
Yeah, so imagine if YouTube issued, tokens to all of the viewers and that enabled the viewers to set, the number of ads that you see per video, or even the types of video that are available on YouTube or whatever. I don't think that that's a person for tax purposes. And then I would even go farther to say okay, assume then that there was also a way for the ad revenues of YouTube to just be streamed to those people. So those people have the ability to sort of collectively determine, how many ads are, how many ads are too many or too few, but they also get the revenues. So there's some tension there. I would say that that's also probably not an entity if the revenues are streamed out on a current basis. But I think reasonable minds can differ. I will say, just looking at tax law says that an entity is in the first instance, a joint venture or other contractual arrangement pursuant to which people, come together and split the profits from that joint venture or other contractual arrangement. I think that the words "or other contractual arrangement" suggests that you need at least an implied or explicit contract. I think if the four of us agreed to start a law firm in New York, even if we don't write up a contract, I think it's clear that we have a contract, right? New York law would govern to settle our disputes. However, if the four of us were each in a different jurisdiction, it becomes a little harder. I think arguably we still are. And we still are an entity because probably each of the four jurisdictions in which we're located would at least take the position that its law applies to adjudicate our disputes. But if we're let's say instead that we don't actually have a common treasury, in these sort of true DAOs, there's typically no treasury. There might be a fee stream directly to the holders, but they're not, there's no sort of physical presence anywhere. It literally is just a vote, to run self-executing code. I think that becomes a much
It's more like TCP/IP.
Yeah, exactly.
So Fatemeh, we have the benefit of actually somebody who's not an American lawyer, and who knows this. Is the answer different in Switzerland, or I don't know if you practice any place else in Europe, but do you think about DAOs as a person differently under Swiss law?
I would say it depends, right? And it's so interesting to hear both of your answers because it's very subjective, first of all, and it's all a matter, I think, of interpretation. In my personal opinion, DAOs are persons, but only philosophically. So, the legal realm does not yet capture this form of organization within its definition and processes of what is a legal person. And I don't think that it's able to do so because these are two different systems that do not speak the same language. And in order to bridge between those two, we need to change either one of them, right? And you mentioned jurisdiction actually, which is very interesting. So even if under U.S. law, DAOs are persons according to U.S. tax law, it may not be the case somewhere else. And how does that even work in practice, right? What does that even mean? Is the first come, first served? I'm not sure about this. So in Switzerland, it's different than Europe, first of all. And it's one of the, I think, early places where you could interact with DAOs. So companies or persons in Switzerland can invoice, for instance, a DAO or vice versa, and this is entirely legal, which I think in Europe is a bit different because you need to have form of identification for the person you're invoicing, which is not possible with DAOs or more complicated. And I think this is the reason why the DAO had a form of entity set up in Switzerland as well back then to interface with it. I think that Switzerland, it's the jurisdiction I know best, but it's also the one that so far has raised less issues with DAOs than, for instance, the US territory, which I think from an outside of the US perspective, the main goal is to hedge the risks posed by the US jurisdiction if the project doesn't have much of an attachment to the US, or ideally not at all, because that's where the risk lies. Although this was the previous panel, but
yeah, I mean, it seems like it's interesting. You mentioned KYC, right? So there's a question of if you create this thing, suddenly you've got to think about what sanctions, OFAC. You've got to think about, are the tokens securities? Then you have to think about, do you have to pay taxes? And then who's the natural person or persons sitting behind it? I mean, the corporations, I think one of the reasons why corporations have been able to exist, at least in the United States, is because there's always a person sitting behind it. You can always go up the corporate tree and find a person. Now, I gather in Panama, that's not the case. But what does it mean when you said invoice a DAO? What are you practically speaking, for the people in this room who are not deep into the technology, what does that mean? How do I do that? Anybody? I mean, Fatemeh, yeah.
Go ahead.
I mean, so look, if a DAO wants to be able to enter into contracts or own things, or wants to hire a lawyer, right? Then it needs an entity, right? And along the spectrum, I think you do have many DAOs that are really just shareholders in a Cayman Islands entity or something, right? And the way they do it is they set up a Cayman Islands foundation that is legally ownerless, but the corporate documents, and I'm saying Caymans, but it could be Panama or any other low tax jurisdiction. The organizational documents say that the foundation will just do whatever the DAO says that it'll do, right? And then really that entity is an alter ego of the DAO. It is a person. It can enter into contracts. It can sue people. It can hire a law firm to represent it, right?
But
I
it
think
sounds like in Switzerland that's not the case. You don't need to go through those gymnastics. You can
No.
just invoice a DAO. So like, what is that?
what is it? Oh, so what does that mean?
How do you do that?
So in practice, it depends, right, on how that particular DAO, the process for honoring the invoices. And oftentimes, as you said, they have entities that are in charge of that. So they would allocate a sum of money to that entity. But in theory, at least, you can directly submit an invoice and like get paid on your, I don't know, USDC wallet, for instance, by the DAO. And this is totally valid within Switzerland. And you're going to report that, right, in your taxes. And as long as you do this, it's entirely fine.
And who has the item of expense? Like when the DAO makes the payment.
Within the item of expense?
Yeah, like
What's the DAO paying for?
yeah, or well, who like does the DAO have a tax deduction? Is the DAO subject to tax, or is it like do you look through to the individual people? If the DAO doesn't make a payment, can like the person sending the invoice sue the members or?
So all of these questions are open, but the thing is that, so put yourself in the shoes of any jurisdiction, maybe outside of this one we're in here, just for the sake of the exercise. It's still income that comes within the jurisdiction, right? That wasn't there. And like, this is a plus and something that we can say, okay, no one can invoice the DAO and maybe this worker will never get paid. And this is less revenue also for the country, right? So I feel like these are two different things that need to be tackled. There is on the individual level of the service provider to a DAO, and then there is on the DAO level. And this is an entirely other question that I'm happy to discuss here, but I don't think that there is any answer yet. I actually nowhere, I think, other than the states, for instance, Wyoming and so on, that tried to legislate and bring it in.
Well, why would anybody? I don't understand why you're part of a DAO. It's when we I went to go to ETH Denver industry conference. You had the opportunity of joining a DAO and going for free or paying $535. I looked at it and I paid $535 because I'm convinced there's the potential risk. I know you did too, Floria, right? Yeah. I think there's a potential risk that as a member of a DAO, which this is an amorphous thing, which may or may not be a general partnership or an unincorporated association, that you can end up being stuck with something. Now, it's probably improbable that somebody would, what would the risk be? The risk would be somebody slips and falls at the Pavilion Hall. Actually worse, there's an explosion at the Pavilion Hall in Denver, God forbid, of course, and 100 people die, right? And there are wrongful death lawsuits in state court in Arapahoe County, Colorado, or whatever county it's in. Well, are they going to sue all of the members of, I mean, if I were a plaintiff's lawyer, I started out doing injury work years ago before insurance. I would sue the DAOs and Unincorporated Association, figure out who the people who were members of it, figure out if any of them had any money.
I paid too, by the way.
Yeah, did you?
Yeah.
So, but you belong to a DAO.
I belong to a DAO because no one's going to slip and fall on an X-copy digital artwork.
Yeah, but go ahead.
One thing that I think is an interesting facet of this idea of belonging to a DAO, right? Or being, and it's similar to the idea of being a shareholder at a corporation, member of an LLC, beneficiary of a trust, is implicit in all of these juridical entities are duties that are duties, right? Yeah. That natural people owe to one another. So if I am a director of a corporation, I have a relationship to the shareholders of that corporation that's defined in the law. And actually, before I go on, how many people here know what a multi-sig is when we use that term? Okay, so most people, but what we're talking about when we bring up multi-sigs is it's basically a type of smart contract that allows a transaction to occur on chain only if a certain threshold of people approve of that transaction. So if I own an account that's myself, I can decide what to do with it. If assets are in a multi-sig, then it takes X number of people to do something with that multi-sig. And so, you know, in Jason's example of his art DAO, where there is a multi-sig that's however many, what is amorphous in that organization, I think what you're getting at, is what are the duties that are actually owed by the signers on that multisig to the other members of the DAO?
Yeah.
If this is an LLC, it's very clear. I can either go to the statute that allows an LLC to exist or the LLC agreement, and it's all defined. But when we talk about being members of a DAO, we don't really know.
Right, are
what
the multi-sig holders, do they have a fiduciary
Right.
relationship to token holders?
And
Right,
And that's
exactly.
why ideally, your DAO basically is the multi-sig, right? Like every member is a voter on the multi-sig.
Yeah, ideally, and that's, I think, to continue to shill MetaLeX a little bit, like we are trying to build tools that enable controls to exist over multi-sigs that are distributed throughout the entire DAO, as opposed to this trust-based relationship, because, and I don't necessarily believe in decentralization as a goal in and of itself, but multi-sigs are highly centralized. And so if we want to establish the decentralization, then you have to put in controls over multi-sigs that allow the power contained in that signature authority to be constrained.
So,
Can I show MetaLeX?
yeah, please go ahead.
I want to show MetaLex because I think it's brilliant, honestly. So like my ideal DAO, as I've already said, is a voting oracle, right? Like it has no assets to itself other than its own native token, and all it can do is vote, to run or not to run self-executing scripts. But obviously that leaves the DAO powerless to say, make grants to developers because it can't actually enter into contracts or to, own IP or to run a website or to do any of the things that a business needs to do. So, what I think, the idea behind MetaLeX is really to sort of automate things that we as lawyers have been doing very clumsily, trying to use, just legal contracts, which is you say, okay, the DAO can use its own native token and let's say fund some entity, like a Cayman Foundation with like 4 independent directors, right? And that entity is expected to, make grants to developers, contract with developers and whatnot, right? The DAO can fund that entity, but fund that entity by funding a multi-sig that is highly parameterized, right? That entity can only make X grants of Y amount per year without further DAO ratification.
So,
yeah.
I mean, so part of what we're talking about, figuring out how to make the most out of distributed software automation, but have guardrails at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a big part of it is just that, like allowing these network systems to sort of live up to their full potential and saying, it's very interesting to hear Fatemeh's perspective on this as a non-US person, where it's like, okay, the U.S. is sort of forcing us to solve these problems, right? Because of their sort of aggressive posture as to what is and is not a person, and like how do you treat a DAO? And so it creates complexity where maybe there doesn't actually need to be complexity in these systems. And so if you can, as a matter of contract, sort of make entities code deferential in certain respects.
When you say code deferential, what do you mean for folks in the audience who?
Well, so when we talk about like DeFi, for example, like decentralized finance, one of the things that I think makes DeFi so interesting is the ability to code financial relationships, right? So if I want to do a collateralized loan on chain, I don't need a written contract for that, right? Because we have smart contracts that can say, all right, under these conditions, your collateral will be seized and can be liquidated as a matter of contract, and nobody has to do anything. And so when we think about the legal relationships of BORGs to DAOs, what we're really talking about is automating those legal relationships, right? In the same way that it is in DeFi, to where if you have the voting oracle, if you have the token holding voters making a decision, there is no discretionary judgment that the BORG can make that would override that decision. So it is not a question of, like, if you look at a director of a corporation, one of the ways you can assess whether that director is doing a good job or a bad job is if they're effectuating the interests or the wishes of the shareholders. When we talk about a code deferential corporation, we want to remove the ability of that director to do a good job or a bad job. It is simply, we want to have entities that simply cannot act outside of what the code allows them to do.
Do you think that's the future of the corporation? And I'll open this up to all of you. Is that what we're going to have in 5, 10, 15, 20 years? Parameterized corporations without human discretion?
Actually, I have a question at this point is to be able to answer yours, is that, like, do BORGs actually solve the issue of liability? And this is in the context of the Tornado Cash case. I don't know if you're familiar with the Tornado Cash software.
Maybe 15 seconds on.
15 seconds. So it's basically a privacy software on Ethereum that was put by OFAC on the sanctions list, and the developers of it were prosecuted as well, and the cases are pending. And interaction as U.S. persons with this protocol is not allowed anymore because of sanctions violation. 15 seconds, and basically it raises the question. It was a DAO. It was distributed. It was decentralized. It was autonomous. And they still went after specific persons. And I'm wondering whether any form of structure like this can bypass this risk. And this risk is not necessarily only, I don't see it only as a Tornado Cash specific risk, but any other permissionless, right, software on the blockchain can be used by bad actors that are on the sanctions list. So how do you avoid kind of this contaminating everything? And to also bounce back, Stephen, on what you said about users of DAOs, the users of Tornado Cash, they have not been prosecuted. They're not encountering any form of liability right now. So although they were actively using and enabling the software to work.
I'm sorry we don't have the folks from Oxbow up here because I think they're actually trying to answer that question. So there are some technical solutions that I think in the works, but from a lawyer standpoint, what you're asking is, can you really build software that gets rid of human liability, both civilly and criminally?
So I think it's iterative. I mean, I think that we're not going to flip a switch and be able to change the way that liability works. And especially, I mean, I think Tornado Cash is almost the most extreme example and the most difficult problem to solve from that respect, because, you know, the courts, and there's been several different courts now that have looked at the Tornado Cash sanctions, I think, in different contexts, but at least one of them, and I can't remember if this was in Florida or in Texas, you know, looked at this and said, well, okay, this is a business, right? This is a money services business and we're just going to treat everybody who's involved with it sort of selectively. They're not treating everybody, but the people who they want to target as individuals who are responsible for operating a money services business. And rightly or wrongly, that's what was decided. And I do think that we're a very long way away from using code to solve that type of problem, right? We have aiding and abetting liability type theories that are they're not going away, and that's how individuals can always get brought in. But when I say it's iterative, I think that we're building towards systems where just like in DeFi, where you have a lender and a borrower who are on opposite ends of the smart contract sort of opting in to this code-based system to determine the parameters of a loan, when you have bilateral or multilateral contracts where every party is sort of opting into code deference, then I do think we will actually start to see systems where liability can be effectively limited using code.
I think, look, I'm not a OFAC lawyer, but I think Tornado Cash is a bit of a red herring. Frankly, I think like all of the lawsuits that currently are pending against DAOs are red herrings in the discussion about like whether, you know, BORGs can resolve this. In all of these suits, like the regulator or the plaintiff's lawyer went after individuals, and I think would have gone after individuals even if there were a legal entity there. Essentially, they're using like a piercing the corporate veil type argument, and they're saying, hey, like this is all fake.
Person, yeah, sure.
Right, this is all fake. Like the developers really are in control of everything, and like that's it. And like, you know, having a legal entity, not having a legal entity isn't going to do anything. I would actually say, you know, arguably, like decentralizing for the sake of decentralizing is probably safer in that situation because it's just harder to find people to sue in that case than, you know, if you had an entity.
OPSEC.
OPSEC, right. But
so we only have 25 seconds left. We can take one question if somebody has one. Yeah, go ahead.
Possibly a large question, but in programmatically establishing parameters, how do you account for creativity and sort of nuance and agility that is required in this sort of day and age to, you know, leverage the corporate structure, but keep things moving and evolving?
Yeah, so I think that's actually a great question, and I think really sort of foundational to BORGs, and it's this idea of the human in the loop, right? We need human discretion in order to make business decisions, in order to create things. And what I think you have to, when you're designing these systems, I think the key is to figure out where the human in the loop should be. So you need to create within this code and within these entities space for human beings to act and make decisions, and make it very clear to anybody who's interacting with the system, this is where a human being will exercise their discretion, and these are the parameters under which that discretion can be exercised. And I think without that, there's no point, in fact, to doing it.
And those are clearly businesses, right? Like I think one problem, you know, that Alex like started out, identifying is that like a lot of DAOs just try to kind of be everything. They're like businesses, but also parameter selectors, and I just think they're not going to survive that way.
Maybe the difference between a protocol and a corporation. Wonderful panel. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.